Welcome back to Silk Warrant. Today in this story is about the moment the will was read, and the truth finally broke the room in silence.
The morning they read my father's will, Diane wore white. Not cream, not ivory. White, the way you wear white to a funeral when you want everyone in the room to look at you instead of the casket. The attorney's office smelled like old paper and something floral, her perfume, thick enough to taste. She had Lauren's hand in hers, patting it in slow, rhythmic circles. The same rhythm she used when she talked over me at dinner. The same rhythm, always the same rhythm. I sat across from them, holding a pen I hadn't been asked to use yet. And I thought, she has no idea what's inside that envelope. Neither did I until 9 months earlier, when my father handed me a key and told me never to mention it to anyone. I never did. My father, Robert Calloway, built his company with two things: a second-hand drafting table and 31 years of showing up before anyone else. He met Diane 6 years ago at a charity gala. She wore white to that, too. He called me that night and said she had real grace. I wrote it down in my journal because it was the first time in my life my father sounded like he was reading from a greeting card. They married 14 months later. Lauren, Diane's daughter from her first marriage, moved into our house in Scottsdale. She was 23. I was 26. Old enough that no one was going to call this a blended family situation. This was something else. Here's what the replacement looked like from the inside. It was slow. It always is. First, it was the Sunday dinners. I'd been the one cooking them since my mother died. 11 years of learning my father's tastes. 11 years of knowing he wanted his coffee before his toast. And his toast cut diagonal, never square. Diane started helping. And then she started hosting. And then one Sunday I arrived and the table was already set, and Lauren was in my chair. The one closest to the window, the one I'd sat in since I was 8 years old. I sat somewhere else. I didn't say anything. I watched Diane watch me not say anything, and she smiled just slightly. In the way people smile when they think they've won a game you don't know you're playing. She was wrong about that. I knew exactly what game we were playing. I just hadn't decided to play yet. Then came the company board seats. My father had always said I'd step into a director role after his retirement. I have an MBA. I'd worked summers at Callaway Group since I was 19. But 8 months before he got sick, there was a board restructuring. Diane had been so helpful during the process. When the dust settled, Lauren, who had never once set foot in the office, held an advisory seat. My name was not on the new documents. I asked my father about it once. We were in his study. He was tired, already losing weight, though we didn't know why yet. He looked at me and said, "Mara, everything I have is yours. I need you to trust me on the how." I held that sentence for 7 months, through his diagnosis, through the treatment, through the last 3 weeks when the hospice nurses came. And Diane managed the schedule, and somehow my visits kept getting shifted to times he was sedated. The morning he died, I was in the parking garage 2 floors below. She'd called me 40 minutes after. I didn't cry in front of her. I walked to a stairwell. I sat on a concrete step that smelled like exhaust and cold metal. And I made a decision. I was going to be very, very patient. 6 weeks before the will reading, Diane called me with a request. Her voice had a texture I'd come to recognize, warm on the surface, purposeful underneath, like a hand extended toward you while the other one is behind its back. "Mara, honey, we need to clear out your father's study. The estate process requires an inventory. I thought it would be meaningful if you were the one to go through his personal items." Meaningful. She was giving me a task that kept me occupied and sentimental while she handled everything else. I understood that. I said yes anyway, because the study was where I needed to be. I went on a Tuesday. The house was quiet. She and Lauren were at a lunch that had been very deliberately scheduled. I walked through the hallways that still smelled faintly of my father's aftershave, cedar, and something sharp, like pencil shavings. And I stood in the doorway of his study for a moment before I went in. I started with the bookshelves, then the filing cabinet. Then the bottom drawer of his desk, the one with the small brass lock that I had not opened in 20 years. The key he'd given me 9 months ago fit exactly. Inside, a manila folder. Inside the folder, a letter in my father's handwriting dated 4 months before his death, and a second document, 8 pages, dense with legal language. Bearing the name of an attorney I didn't recognize, a firm in Phoenix I'd never heard of. I read it twice standing up. Then I sat on the floor. Then I took photographs of every page with my phone. Locked the drawer, put the key in my coat pocket, and left the house. I didn't touch anything else. I didn't take anything. I left the study exactly as I found it. Every book, every folder. Every dust ring on the shelf where his coffee mug used to sit. What was in that folder should not have existed. Not because it was hidden, but because of what it proved Diane had been doing for the last 2 years without anyone knowing she'd been watched. My father was many things. Quiet, precise. Occasionally distant in the way men of his generation believed was discipline rather than avoidance. But he was not careless. He had never in his life been careless. And he had been watching Diane from the moment he got the diagnosis. The letter was addressed to me. It began, "Mara, if you're reading this, you found the key. I knew you would. I need you to call the attorney whose name is on the second document before the will reading. Tell him." The clause is active. I called him from my car in the parking lot of a gas station on Camelback Road. His name was Gerald Fitch. He answered on the second ring as if he'd been expecting my call for weeks. "Ms. Calloway, your father told me you'd be precise and early. He was right on both counts. Can you come in Friday?" Gerald Fitch's office was in a building that looked like it had been there since 1962 and intended to outlast everything else in Phoenix by roughly the same margin. He was 70, maybe older, with the kind of stillness that comes from knowing things other people don't. He shook my hand and said, "Before we begin, I want you to know that your father retained me specifically because I had no connection to his estate attorney, the one your stepmother recommended." He wanted separation. I sat down. "How long ago did he hire you?" 18 months. He set a folder on the desk between us. He was methodical. He came in once a month. He brought documentation. He was building a record. The documentation covered the board restructuring. Diane had orchestrated it, not just helped. She had connections to 2 of the 3 outside board members through her first husband's business circle. She'd worked it slowly, over months. Timed perfectly to my father's illness when he was too exhausted to scrutinize every decision. Gerald also showed me something I hadn't known. Diane had a will of her own that she had updated 3 months after my father's diagnosis. In it, she left everything, including any inheritance from my father, to Lauren. With no provision for Mara Calloway whatsoever. She'd filed it with the estate attorney handling my father's will. The same attorney. The conflict of interest was not subtle. Gerald had flagged it. The estate attorney had not disclosed it. Then Gerald said the thing that changed everything. "Your father also had a conversation with someone you know. Someone who was troubled by what she was seeing in the house. She came to me voluntarily 2 months ago. I think you should know her name." It was Carol, Diane's sister. The one who came to every family dinner. The one who always seemed uncomfortable. The one who laughed slightly too late at Diane's jokes, like she was covering for something she didn't want to confirm. Carol had watched the last 2 years up close. And she decided she wasn't willing to stay quiet about it. She had provided Gerald with text messages, emails. A voicemail recorded by accident in which Diane discussed timing the will with Lauren while my father was upstairs on oxygen. I sat in that office for an hour. I did not cry. I did not speak very much. I asked Gerald 2 questions. Both of them were practical. The will reading was on a Thursday morning. Gerald sat beside me. The estate attorney, a man named Prescott who had clearly not expected to see an unfamiliar face at the table, went visibly still when Gerald placed his business card on the table without a word. Diane didn't notice at first. She was doing the thing she always did when she felt certain. She was performing calm, hands folded, posture composed. When Prescott began reading, she was already patting Lauren's hand. Slow circles, the same rhythm. She did it without looking down. The first portion of the will was largely what she expected. The house, the vehicles, certain personal assets. Her name appeared, Lauren's name appeared, she sat a little straighter, then Prescott paused. He looked at Gerald. Gerald nodded once. Prescott said, "I am required at this point to introduce a secondary testamentary document which supersedes sections 4 through 9 of the primary will." He adjusted his glasses. "This document contains what the testator designated as the conditional clause." Diane's hand stopped moving. That was the first time I had ever seen her rhythm break. The clause was 4 pages. My father had written it with Gerald over the course of 6 months. It was precise, legal, airtight. The core of it was simple. Any beneficiary found to have manipulated the company board for personal financial gain or concealed conflicts of interest during the estate planning process would immediately lose their inheritance rights. Everything would revert to the primary heir, Mara Calloway, in full. The documentation my father had assembled for 18 months was attached as evidentiary support. Gerald had submitted it to the probate court the morning before the reading. Lauren looked confused. "What does that mean?" Diane said nothing. She was staring at the folder on the table, the one with the text messages, the voicemail, the board records. And the color was draining from her face in a way that had nothing to do with the lighting in the room. Then she looked at me. For the first time all morning, she looked directly at me. I held her gaze. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. She started to say something, and then her hand moved toward Lauren's arm again. That same slow, rhythmic pat, but this time, Lauren pulled away. "You were right, Diane. Dad trusted you completely." She swallowed hard. "You were wrong about what he was doing with that trust." Prescott finished reading. Gerald gathered his materials. I signed 3 documents. The whole thing took less than 40 minutes. When it was over, Diane stood up. Her white blazer had a crease across the shoulder from where she'd been gripping the back of her chair. She walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame. She turned around once. I think she wanted to say something composed, something that would let her leave with a version of dignity still intact. But Lauren was already 5 steps ahead of her, walking out without waiting. And Carol, who had sat quietly in the back of the room the entire time, caught my eye as she left and gave me one small nod. Diane left without saying anything. The room smelled like old paper. It still smelled like her perfume, but it was quieter now. The kind of quiet that comes after a sound you've been hearing for so long, you stopped noticing it, until it finally disappeared. I still have the key. It's in a small dish on my kitchen counter. The one my mother bought at a flea market in Tucson the year I turned 10. The key doesn't open anything anymore. The drawer is mine now. The house is mine. The company is mine. But I keep it there because it reminds me of something my father understood that took me a long time to learn. Patience is not the same thing as passivity. Silence is not the same thing as surrender. And the most powerful position you can ever hold in a room is the one where you already know how the story ends before anyone else realizes it's a story. My father saw what was happening. He couldn't stop it while he was living, not without a fight that would have cost him the last months he had. So he built something instead. He built it quietly, carefully. The same way he built everything, with a drafting table and 30 years of showing up before anyone else. He showed up for me one last time. I just had to be patient enough to receive it. And maybe that's the real question, not whether betrayal changes people, but whether silence reveals who they were all along. If the people closest to you had to describe who you are, the version of you when no one is watching, when it costs something to stay quiet, when it would be so much easier to react, would their version match who you actually are? Before you leave, tell me honestly, if the people closest to you described who you really are when nobody's watching, would you recognize yourself in their version?